Welcome to episode 6 of the Dadger, where sports, family, and Wisconsin pride all intersect. Today's guest is a legend in Wisconsin high school football community, Rodney Wedig. With over 30 years of coaching experience, Coach Wedig has stacked up a legacy of excellence: 16 playoff appearances, 9 conference titles, a state championship, and more coaching awards than I can count, including being named a Packers Coach of the Week and recently inducted into the Wisconsin Football Coaches Association Hall of Fame. That's a mouthful. Beyond the gridiron, he's a proud father of 5 and a grandfather as well. We're honored to have him on to talk coaching, leadership, family, lasting impact on high school sports in Wisconsin, and of course the Badgers. Thanks for being on, Rod.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. How you doing today?
Uh, it's the middle of the week. We're getting through there.
Yeah, the technology felt like Wednesday today, didn't it?
Yeah. So usually I start these with kind of the person's upbringing here. Um, you're you're 7 of 11 kids,
Correct.
and grew up in a farm family. Where some of your older siblings, mainly I'm thinking of my dad here, had no real interest in sports.
Yeah.
So where did the interest for you in sports develop?
Well, it is kind of crazy because of the five boys, 5 boys, 6 girls. Um, Mary, Pam, the girls, they played sports a little bit. I was the only boy in the family that ever played a varsity sport. But actually, it's weird. It came from cousin Donnie, who he was a pretty good football player for Cuba City. But it also came from Al. Al, older brother Al, he was and he's an accountant, so he was a stats geek. Like he would study baseball, football. He was a Packer fan. You know what I mean? And you have to understand, being a Packer fan back in those days was not easy because the Packers were not good. And
It's
so,
like Bears fans now.
yeah, right. So he was a super sports fan, but he was also that dude that was probably picked last in P. So I mean, but because he was such a sports fan, and then I had cousin Donnie that he lived with us most of the summer. To kind of, he was closer to my age where we could kind of battle it out, and then your grandpa, my dad, Art. We always had a basketball hoop on the side of the shed somewhere, and so I just kind of fell in love with it when I was a kid. It just competitive. I mean, I would go play football by myself in the backyard. We didn't have phones back in those days, so you had to do something to entertain yourself.
uh, so you said Grandpa set up some stuff for you. When you got done with practice or games, were you still expected to come home and milk or feed calves or do chores?
Well, for the most part, practice. By the time I got back from practice, most of the chores would be done. And but yeah, I mean, you woke up in the morning and you got all the chores done before you jumped on the bus, went to school, and then you went to practice. And depending on the day, but no, he was pretty good. As far as there were enough kids in the family, again to kind of get the chores done. But I'm telling you though, the thing is, I was still, again, as a young kid, I'd be out there on a night like tonight where it's going to be light until 8:30. I'd be out shooting baskets or throwing the football to myself, whatever it might be. Just again, because there really wasn't a whole lot else to do out there.
You played football, basketball, and baseball. Was football always your number one sport? Because a lot of the football guys that I've had on here, their favorite sport's actually basketball.
Well, here's what I always tell kids. I was like, football is one of those sports where practice is probably, of the sports, the most miserable. I mean,
Yeah.
practice is hard. It's not easy. Um, but football games are by far the best. Okay. Um, but looking back at it, now, here's the thing a lot of kids don't realize in high school is, football, you only get a few chances to throw on the pads and compete. I played basketball in a competitive league until I was like 45, 46 years old. You could, and I loved basketball. Don't get me wrong. Baseball was just, I'm not even sure why I played baseball. I wasn't very good. It was just something to pass the spring, so I didn't have to go home and do chores.
Yeah. um, so you ended up going to Southwest State in Minnesota. Was that move kind of wanting to kind of get away from small town Wisconsin a little bit, or was there another reason for that?
Yeah, I mean, one of it, at first, I went to the University of Dubuque. I tried playing football there. The coach,
Okay.
and it's one of those things that I took with me coaching is like the coach literally ripped the joy of football out of me. And it's one thing I've carried with me as a coach forever. It's like, you know what? I don't care if you're the third string wide receiver that may never see the field. I'm going to come and talk to you. I'm going to see how your day was. How'd your algebra test go? Things like that, which I think are important. And so when I transferred out to Southwest State, there were two things. One, I knew I had to get away from my high school buddies because or else I was not going to graduate college. The second was, quite frankly, the cheapest school I could find.
Yeah.
And so I went out there not knowing a soul. I didn't go on a college visit. I just packed all my stuff into a little car because that's all I owned and went out there. But it was a great experience.
What was your major out there? Because in research here, I was reading some articles. It seems like you, over your tenure, have taught quite a bit of broad subjects.
Yeah. So when I was out there, I started with the history and the education degree, U.S. history. Well, then, I'm sitting there and I'm kind of enjoying college. So they're like, well, if you take some economics, things like that, you get a broad field social studies. So I did that. So I graduated with actually a U.S. history major, broad field social studies, so I could teach kind of anything. Well, then when the triplets were born, um, they had like this developmental psychologist there because they were all under 3 pounds. So it was at the time, luckily we were young, dumb, and stupid and didn't know, and we didn't know any better. These kids, this is pretty high risk. And I kind of fell in love with psychology. So as I was teaching in Almond my first few years, believe it or not, Adam, I know I'm old, but yeah, there were actually online courses back there. The internet wasn't quite as smooth as it is now.
Yeah, well, we had some trouble tonight, but
you type in the response, it might take 10 years. But then I actually took some psychology and got that minor.
Okay, yeah, okay, that's what I was seeing. So, you moved to Green Lake. Did you guys have the triplets before that, or?
Oh no, we moved there with the triplets. Yeah, so
Okay.
because I had worked at a small private school in Marshall, Minnesota. That
Oh,
was
that's
my
right.
first
Yep.
coaching job, coaching middle school girls basketball, and I knew I needed a bigger opportunity because working at a private school, I think I might have been the only male there. I think the other male was the band teacher, as a K through 8, because it was all everyone else's second income.
Yeah.
So I knew with my growing family, I needed to take a chance. And I rolled the dice, and hats off to Tam, my wife, for doing that. She trusted in me. I went over there with basically nothing but a guarantee as a head girls basketball coach at Green Lake and assistant football. And then I subbed and actually worked at the Oshkosh Northwestern as a sports writer at night. And yeah, we lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with infant, or by that time almost toddler triplets, for a year or two. And like I said, hats off to Tam for that.
Yeah, I was gonna say I recently know how like the shell shock of having a new kid is. You guys
Yeah,
had had 3.
how is the little one?
Yeah, he's good, man. He's
Yeah.
good. He's getting his voice now, so he's screaming
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, he's getting big. I always told my students this in psychology. I said, marriage will change your life a little bit. I said, when you have kids, your life as you know it is over. It's a new world.
Yes, for sure. So you get your first head coaching gig. Was that 2 years after moving to Green Lake that you guys went to?
It was actually the next year. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I got very fortunate.
So what was the state of the program like taking that over? Like when you first went in there?
Well, trust me, at that time, as a 27-year-old with 1 year of an assistant coach and 2 years as a middle school coach, no good program would have hired me at that. So they were struggling number wise. They had never really been good. It was I fell into this. it was one of those crazy things. And this is something that I still tell to kids, every kid to this day. Like when I was teaching, I was like, every day is basically a job interview because you never know the person you're talking to right next to you, who he knows or who she knows that might one day cut you a break. And so
Yeah.
when I was at Green Lake, the head baseball coach and assistant boys basketball coach was Tim Polk. Okay, well I didn't know this at the time, but I was the head girls coach and I was helping out in football and talked to him. Great guy. I think his brother Kyle, I think, is in the College Baseball Hall of Fame coaching because he was coach at Winona State. So I get a job offer as a full-time sports writer for Oshkosh Northwestern. So I've got to decide, okay, wait, I got triplets. At this time, the teaching health insurance is it's awesome. So I can't kind of give up that. So I don't want to give that up. First place I stopped was Almond Bancroft. The superintendent there was Ed Polk, just happened to be Tim's dad. And so he brings me in and he starts talking to me. And he goes, well, we have a temporary long-term sub job open. Well, and he didn't tell me, I'm sorry, he didn't tell me that day. He called me a little while later and said, would you want to be the head football coach? And right away, I'm like, oh my God, I'm not qualified. I'm not ready for this. I'm like, I didn't, I played like a half a year of college football. I'm like, oh goodness. But then, once he tied a teaching job into it with the probability of it being long-term, I was like, let's roll. And then, the first year was not good. We were 0-9. I walked back into Ed Polk's office for the evaluation, almost expecting to get fired. He goes, well, I saw some good things. He goes, here, go to the coach's clinic, go do this. And I'm like, I was, it drove my wife crazy. Tam Deering, like, I'm watching every bowl game sitting here filling out a notebook.
Yeah. So that first year, did you go in with knowing how that program was? And so like, you were just hoping to get some experience out of it, or like, what was your goal going in that first year?
Well, again, and I've had this conversation with my sons. The wonderful thing about going into that position is I was kind of oblivious to almost everything. I mean, I walked in there like, okay, well, I can do this. I've always told them, I said, if older me walked into a program like that, I would know, and I'd be like, oh God, there's no way we're going to win. But I was young and cocky, and I'm like, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And I'll never forget the first game. We're playing New Lisbon, which is a pretty good program. First drive, I've got it scripted. We go down and score like right away, 6-0. I'm like, I got this. Right? we lost 42-6, but
they said, all right, we're going to start playing now.
I really went in there kind of blindly. And it helped me. It helped me do that. And it helped the kids believe in me, which ended up getting that program going. And, then after the first year, like I said, then I started studying the history, talking to the kids and just selling them on making history. I think that's a big thing is like, you look back again, I taught history, but you go back and if you can convince a kid, hey, you could be part of something special, I think that's important.
How long did it take them to buy into that program and that belief? Because sometimes it takes, quite a while for to turn that around.
Well, again, very fortunate spot where I was. So my first year, my quarterback was a sophomore. My starting running back was a sophomore. My best two linemen were, so I knew I had a group. And then the second year, we had one of those years. It was kind of like my first year at Bigfoot, where it's like every bounce goes your way. You're not sure why, but you know what I'm saying? Every bounce, every call just goes your way. We missed the playoffs, but we went from 0-9 to 4-5 with most of the juniors. And then, so then everyone's in, the community's in. It was, it was very exciting. Like I said, those days at home, and I wouldn't trade for anything. It was, we built something special, and the kids were great.
I assume it was still this small, but I Googled Almond Bancroft. They got about 110 kids in the entire high school today. Was it that small when you coached there? And
we were a lot bigger. We were 145.
There you go. But did you feel like you could relate to the players a little more, having come from a small school yourself?
Yeah, exactly. Because I knew where it was, and I didn't panic. this is no kidding too. I had 18 kids show up the first day. And I'm like, okay, talk to a couple of your friends and buddies. I mean, I still the entire year. Again, Adam, I was much younger. I was playing scout team quarterback and scout team middle linebacker. I was running different things. I mean, I was coaching linebackers, O line, and quarterbacks, and so yeah, it was it was a different world than where I ended up.
With it being that small, did you have to like really scheme in so to preface this, you had some success, 3 or 4 years into it. You guys made a playoff appearance.
Mm-hmm.
Did you really have to like scheme around your players' strengths and weaknesses, like more so than, the bigger schools that we'll eventually talk about that you got to?
Well, absolutely. And I'll tell any coach listen to me, and they'll probably think I'm lying, but it is easier to scheme like when I'm playing Sun Prairie and schools like that because they're all by the book. They went to this clinic, they saw this coach, they're following this college. At first when I was at Almond, you saw Wing T, you saw Wishbone because we had a lot of River Falls at the time. River Falls coaches there. You could see defenses that you've never seen before. You know what I mean? Because at a small school, you've got to move people around and hide a weakness. And so you'll see all kinds of different fronts where at the larger schools, it's like, okay, they run a 3-4. Okay, they copied this, from North Dakota State. Or, so you kind of have this, okay, I know what they're running. I've been to the same clinics as them. And then the thing is, in today's world, like when I was in Bigfoot, we would go, this is when the spread started taking over stuff. You'd go from a wing tee to a spread to an option team to, whatever they're running, we're not even sure.
Yeah.
And so scouting was actually almost more difficult the smaller schools you were at.
So, like I alluded to, you had success kind of building over your first 4 years. 4 years in, you get the school's first playoff appearance. Did you at that time, you've been talking about how, young and kind of inexperienced you were, did you have a realistic outlook on how deep you guys could make a playoff run? Or were you so hyped up? Was the school so hyped up just for your own first playoff experience and the schools? Or were you like, okay, we still have to play the game?
Well, again, going back to it, as a young guy, I was hyped up. We played Abbotsford that first round. So, at the time, again, this is my third year there. I'd gone to college out in Southwest State, Minnesota. So the high school football I knew, I didn't know a lot. I didn't realize Abbotsford was in the same conference as Stratford and Edgar, which at the time and still today are two of the most powerful small school schools. So I'm like, okay, they finished in third place. We got the same record. In those days, you would drive. This is crazy. You'd drive to a central location in some like Quick Trip parking lot and exchange VHSs. Then you come back, and everyone looks slow on VHS.
Yeah.
And so I'm scouting, and I'm thinking, okay, yeah, we got similar records, and they crushed us. And so it was my welcome to reality that, okay, our conference maybe is not like the Merriwood Conference at the time, So that was kind of a crash back to reality. But to be honest with you, that season was amazing, to make that playoff run.
You just kind of talked about what I want to touch on next. So you talk about exchanging VHS tapes and having to drive to Quick Trip and do all that. So I assume you were the sole person behind this, like running practices, opening weight rooms in the off season, maybe doing scouting on opponents, watching a ton of game footage, obviously, like you said, both in and out of season. That young, but having 3 kids at home, how did you balance everything between your work and personal life?
Well, the good thing was when my second year at Almond, the school actually owned a house right across from high school, so they rented it out to us. Tammy didn't work because she's got triplets, and then had Gus. So we have 4 kids under the age of 3. But the nice thing was I could run home, at lunch. If we had an away game, I didn't have to hang out at the school for 2 hours,
Sure.
waiting for the bus because I could just run home and hang out for a while. And so, yeah, you really had to balance it. And the one thing I've always done, I still to this day, I've always said I'm not ever going to call anybody on the Sundays. Sundays was always, even when the kids were older in high school and they had things going on, I was like, listen, Sunday, because, when you have 4 kids in high school, they're here and here. I said, Sundays, we are going to sit down and we're going to have our one family meal, that everyone has to be there. You're not going to a friend's house. We're all going to, Sundays was always our day. And still to this day, I've kind of maintained that. But no, it was tough. And again, like I said, luckily my wife is a football fan and she kind of understood it. But yeah, at that time I had one paid assistant, and one of my ex-brother-in-laws was a volunteer that, was obviously just in the season. So yeah, it was basically me.
So 98 and 99, you post 2 and 3 win seasons. This is the first time in your 10-year career that you hit a sort of peak and valley moment. How
Right.
did you take that, and what was your mindset after sort of the first 2 seasons, and then having found success the year prior, and then kind of coming back down?
Well, again, I talked about my first year when we were 0-9. We were loaded with sophomores. Like we started so many, and so obviously those sophomores were seniors when we made the playoffs. So they graduate, and you start over. New quarterback. Andrew Bradley was my quarterback. He was a 4-year starter. So you got a new quarterback. I had at that time nobody I could think of as a running back. I actually went to UW Platteville at the time. Emmerdorfer was at UW
Oh,
Platteville.
yep.
And he was running these quad looks and empty looks. And so I actually brought a little bit of that to the old CWC small, where we were running empty looks and things like that. But, it was one of those things where I kind of knew it was coming. The one year we won 3 games, we were this close to qualifying for the playoffs of being 4-3 in the conference. We had upped our non-conference schedule a little bit, making it a little tougher. But you hit those lulls, and again, like I said, as a young coach, you're kind of riding that high, but yet at the same time, that first year, no, it was the second year. Sorry. That second year, I think when we won 3 games, we were again just loaded with sophomores. And at that time, I had also started up the track program in Albany, even though we didn't have a track. We started the track program.
Once again, Belmont.
And I started the track program, and suddenly I'm like, okay, we got some dudes that have some speed. Nick Sanchez, one of my running backs, one of the best running backs ever coached. He in conference. This is a great combination. He finished second in shot and third in the 100.
Really?
That's definitely a cool thing. You don't see that at bigger schools.
No. Over the next 3 seasons, you win more and more games, culminating in your final season there in 2002 when you win 11 games.
Yes.
What was that feeling like? And had you been thinking about, potentially moving on leading up to that? Like, did you feel like you had achieved everything you could at Alma Bancroft and it was time for a new challenge? Or walk me through the process, I guess.
Yeah. So, and the thing is, I wasn't before. Obviously as a teacher and a coach, with 4 kids at the time, may have been 5 by that time. Let me do the math. You're always thinking, I need to maybe go to a bigger school, make some more money. So it's always in the back of your head. So it's like one of those guys where I wasn't desperate to move, and I didn't necessarily even want to move, but you always kind of look out. And then when we had that run, and I'll tell you this, Adam, straight out, that still might be, even with the state championship and things like that, that still might be one of my favorite seasons of all time, because in a small community, when you make a run like that, it's kind of stereotypical, but it's for real. Like when we went and played Pacelli in level 3, there was not a person left in the town. I mean, hell, in Wisconsin, I think even all the bars closed down. So for a small town, that's pretty impressive.
Right.
But I'll still never forget, because I during COVID, I made a list of like my top players, my top games, and that year, still one of the top games I've ever coached. So we're playing Iola, and so this is week 8. It's for the championship. Whoever wins, we had beaten Iola once before, and that was the year we made the playoffs. Which, on a side note, Tim Polasek was the quarterback at the time, who is now the head coach at North Dakota State.
Okay.
Yeah, so when Tim would come and recruit guys when I was at Bigfoot, I'd always give him grief. I'm like, hey, I remember we beat you. It was the first time in Almond Bancroft history that ever beaten Iola was his sophomore year. But anyhow, so we're playing down there, and again, it's one of those things where the first part of the game just goes absolutely great. My script works. We're up 13-0, and then it was from then on they probably outgained us 3-0. 3-1 in yards. They were driving down and we would stop them. And I'll still never forget. So it's kind of like Belmont, it's this, for a good program, it's a crappy field,
Yeah.
The press box is basically a construction trailer on some lifts.
Right.
It's got the infield, the baseball infield is in one corner. Oh my God. And there's just ropes around there. So there's no track. And so people are 3 deep on the ropes everywhere. And Iola's about to tie the game. And Chris Lamb dives and knocks the ball out of the kid's hand. And we recover at our own 1 yard line and kind of preserve the win. And I'll tell you what, the whole crowd just went insane. It was absolutely one of my fondest memories coaching. I loved it.
2003 rolls around. You go to Bigfoot. Was that a little bit different? Was that a little bit different feel than Almond Bancroft right away? Like a little bit bigger school, more athletes, maybe more resources?
Yeah, I mean, in a different clientele too. Was one of the big things. Bigfoot was very interesting, is because it draws from Fontana, which is on Lake Geneva. So you've got kind of the white collar kids. Walworth is kind of the blue collar kids, and then Sharon, the small community. I always said that's where all our linemen came from. They were down to earth, hardworking, smart kids, and so it was a different clientele. I mean, there was I think it was my first or second year at Bigfoot. We're trying to run our contact days at the time where they only allowed 5. I had one kid miss to go to a regatta, which I didn't even know what a regatta was at the time. It's something with yachts. And another kid missed to go show his pigs at the Walworth County Fair. so you got those kind of kids. You got this mix of kids. And, again, when I took the job, I went down there. And like I said, I wasn't desperate to leave. I called them. I said, there was a socialize opening and a coaches opening, head coaching. And I said, interview me for social studies first. I said, if you don't think I'm a good enough teacher to hire, send me home. I don't want to waste your time with the coaches thing. If you think I'm a good teacher, then we'll go through the coaching process. Because I told them, I said, I'm not coming down here just to coach. If you want to give the social job to somebody else, I'll stay at Almond. I'm fine with that. So, and again, it was a good move for the family. A good, like I said, I also got very fortunate that at the time Travis Frederick was an 8th grader, and so that doesn't hurt.
No. Well, it ended up being a great move for everybody because you built an absolute powerhouse there. When it was all said and done, you had 11 straight seasons in the playoffs, 7 consecutive conference titles, a state championship. Had you done anything differently, like majorly differently from the program you built in Almond Bancroft? Or what do you think? I guess what do you think was a key factor in building such a successful run there, such a successful and tenured run there, I should say?
Well, to be honest with you, I didn't really change a lot, and that's one of the things I always tell young coaches is you always got to be who you are. You know what I mean? There's different kind of successful coaches. There's ones that are like geniuses with X's and O's and they can draw anything up, and there's others that are like just the team building kind. I've always seen myself as no one's ever accused me of being a genius with X's and O's, but you know what? I can get kids motivated. I can get them going there, but I know enough about X's and O's to be successful, and I surround myself with people who are more X's and O's guys and things like that. But what really changed for me was I had the opportunity. This wasn't an Almond yet, and when Brett Bielema was head coach at Wisconsin, they would hire high school coaches, and I still don't know how my name got on the list because It's like John Hope from Lancaster,
Yeah.
Takis from Stratford, all these guys. And I'm like, I don't know how my name got on the list. And at first, as a young guy, you're like, boy, I don't know if I'm ready for this. I don't want to go work the Badger camp. I got to sleep in the dorms and things like that. I don't know anybody, but I'm like, okay, I'll do it. Well, then all of a sudden you are around some of the smartest high school coaches in Wisconsin. And you have the opportunity in between practices to talk to them and pick their brains. And, so when I went to Bigfoot, I'd seen that and I'd gotten to talk to them and I'd worked a lot of camps. And so all of a sudden, I had a little better understanding of what it takes. And I also did a lot of things was going to other sports practices. Okay, I want to go watch the boys basketball team practice. I want to watch baseball practice. I want to watch these guys. I want to watch how they conduct their practices. How does this look? How does a college practice look? That was one of my big things was practices. How do these practices look so I can copy that? And then, one of the big turning points too was, I made a reference to Travis Frederick. When he was a sophomore and started getting recruited by Wisconsin, that opens a whole nother door because not only was he getting recruited by Wisconsin, like he was a super bright guy. So every Ivy League coach is coming through there. I'm getting a call, hey, Mr. Wedig, Yale's here to go talk to Travis. I'm like, okay. And so you're talking to all these coaches, and I always say that I don't care if you're a coach who's won 10 championships or a coach who just finished 1-8. You can always learn from every coach, something. So I just started picking coaches' minds, not just football coaches, any coach. And, I think the other great thing was on my coaching staff at Bigfoot, because this is almost impossible to find. On my coaching staff at Bigfoot, I had a math teacher, a special ed teacher, another social studies teacher. I had a science teacher. I had, there was only 2 guys on my entire staff, and one was a volunteer that were not teachers. So when those kids came into the school, you had a coach in basically almost every classroom they would go to.
Yeah.
And that's impossible to find these days.
So during your tenure at Bigfoot, you were able to coach 2 of your kids in state title games. Can you talk a little bit about those teams and what it was like having your own kids out there? Well, we'll get to it a little bit later. And coaching with them for a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it's first of all, it does add a little something. I think one thing, because I'll never forget, I've always felt I'm pretty good at separating myself from coach to dad. You know what I mean? Like when we got home, I never talked about football unless they asked a question. I might on a Sunday say, hey, Jake, did you see this on film? Things like that. But when the game was over, we never talked football. It was, okay, this is family. But I still remember one time when it separated, when Jake kind of took a cheap shot in the Delvin-Darien game where a kid dove at his knee and the trainer goes, I think it's his ACL. And it took me about 2 plays to get back to the coaching mode, like, holy cow, I still got to call plays. You know what I mean? Because all of a sudden as a dad, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. Gus was pretty easy because, I think Gus from his freshman year when I threw him on there, I've grabbed him by the face mask and, said things that only fathers can say to a kid.
Gus was built for football, man.
But you know what? It was a special sort of timing. And here's the other thing that I think is another reason you make a run like this is almost all those kids, so when we had our 7-year run of conference titles and we went to state 3 times, almost all of those kids at one point had been in my living room. You know what I mean? Like, They knew my sons. I knew them. They knew me not only as a coach, they knew that I was also a father. They knew that, there were other things more important in my life than trying to win games. And I think that means a lot for kids. And I, to this day, from the time I was, at Bigfoot, even in Almond, I always talked to boys. I was like, listen, you guys, everyone talks about, oh, I want to go D1, I want to do this. I said, the most important job you're ever going to have is being a father and be a good father. And I said, it's not that tough. I was like, just be there for them and be there, and it's like, so I've always preached that as far as like the family balance with coaching. I mean, winning's great, but at the end of the day, like, able to celebrate that with my sons. And the other thing too is it's the other side of it. There's only one team that ever wins their final game. There's
Right.
only one group of seniors that wins their final game, and that's the state champ. So you have, when we lost in state championship his junior year, level 3 is senior. I mean, that's tough to comfort your son, who's been so competitive and lives and breathes and dies football. It's a tough thing as a father. It's bad as a coach to lose. It's tougher to see your son go through that.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about the move from Alma Bancroft to Bigfoot was, you know, kind of you had to tie in the professional aspect of it. Was that the same deal with Beloit Memorial, or
No,
was it a little
Beloit,
bit different there?
no, it was different. And this is one thing that's a lot of people ask me, what the hell were you doing? But it kind of goes back to this. And Adam, this is a conversation I had with your grandfather, Art, when I was 16. So Art was a big bowler, and one night I think he hit the first 8, maybe 8, 9 strikes even. I don't know. He was close to a perfect game. And I told him, I said, if I ever roll the perfect game, I don't know if I'd ever bowl again. I mean, what's the point, right? And I think that kind of came back to haunt me. It's like after we lost in the state game in 2012, which was a punch in the gut overtime loss, I think part of me was like, I don't know what more I can do here. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I never wanted to be that guy. And this was one thing I had always in the back of my mind, because when I first started coaching, I always thought of myself as a builder. I never had a goal. I'm going to win a state championship. My goal was I'm going to find some team that's terrible, try to make them a winner. That's what's really satisfying for me. And
Yep.
so I started looking at Bigfoot and where we were headed, and I'm like, because other coaches were like, what the hell were you doing? You stay there another 10 years, they're going to name the field after you. And I'm like, but I don't want to be that old guy who's going 5-5, and the parents are too afraid to say,
Yeah.
maybe it's time to step aside. I never wanted to be that guy, because I've seen those guys.
Yep.
And all of a sudden it's like, oh, I've won a state title. I've done everything. All I'm going to do, I'm just going to keep showing up, and we got good enough kids. We're going to make the playoffs and lose in the first round. I was like, never want to be that guy. And so when Beloit Memorial, this is no kidding. I was like, okay, if I can turn this program around, all of a sudden I'm up here, with the coaches. I'm like the dude that can turn anything around. And so I wanted to roll the dice and do that. I'll tell you this: I wasn't successful coaching there, but as a person, those kids were probably just a whole different world. I always tell the kids in Beloit, I was like, you guys are 12 minutes from Orfordville, but you're in a different world. It's a different world. It's a world a lot of people in Wisconsin don't get into. And Matthew, as reluctant as he was at first, I'll tell you what, the friends he has from Beloit Memorial, he wouldn't trade for anything.
Yeah. So Matthew, you coached him there. Was that a bittersweet moment knowing you would be? I mean, that would be the last kid you'd coached there, last of your children, I should say.
Yeah, well, it was bittersweet. For one, his senior year, I thought we had a good chance of making the playoffs. And, you kind of, at this time in the Big Eight, you knew at Beloit, Middleton, no. Sun Prairie, no. Verona, no. But can we beat this team, this team, and this team? And Janesville Craig was kind of our first game of the year, and it was one of those border teams that I knew if we beat them, we had a good chance. And we lost to them, and I realized that the class below him, their heart wasn't really into it. It was tough. I literally, when I went home, I apologized to him. I said, you know what? I thought I could do this. I thought we could make the playoffs for the first time since 1999. I don't know what's going to happen now, but he put everything in. But at the same time, he realizes now, when we look back at it, that if he had not been at Beloit, he probably doesn't get free college. So
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? Because he was playing against guys that were going to Division I schools.
Yeah, the exposure, right?
Yeah.
Looking back, would you do anything differently whether it be, maybe not taking a job or you take the job and do something differently within the program?
Not really. Like I said, here's the cool thing is my career. I think is very unique, is because I've coached Division 7. I think actually when I started Almond, it was Division 6 because there wasn't 7 divisions. Division 4 one year in Bigfoot, we were up to Division 3, Milton Division 2, Beloit Division 1. I've coached 0-9 teams. I've coached 14-0 teams. I've coached everything in between. I've always told my students this when I was in Orfordville. I said, listen, I've probably coached about every kind of kid Wisconsin, or taught every kind of kid Wisconsin has to offer, and I think that is a great career where I've had that opportunity to, coach every kind of kid, and it's, because one of the cool things, and I kind of when I text you that is like, so this year I coached girls basketball and middle school track. And, and I said, one of the beautiful things about coaching middle school track is it takes you back to why you do it. It's about the kids. It's about teaching and teaching the kids. It's not about rings and trophies and things like that. And it's been very cool.
You end up leaving Beloit and take a job at Milton, like you said. Go 9-2 your first season there. Another high on the coaching roller coaster, so to speak. You finished the rest of your head coaching career there, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Tell me what it was like giving up the reins after being a head coach for so long. Was that I assume that was a pretty tough decision for you.
Well, again, the first year. So when I took the Milton job, I told them no the first time they called, and then they're like, well. So I'm assuming they didn't find somebody they wanted because I had told them no before Christmas. They called me, I think it was February, would you at least come in for an interview? Well, then I talked to Gus. Gus was, graduating from Duluth at the time. And I'm like, okay, I can give Gus a defensive coordinator job. They didn't have a teaching spot for me, which, again, I wasn't crazy about. But, they basically, after our scrimmage, they got Gus in the school. So I took it because I knew Gus was the defensive coordinator, and I was actually ready at this time to go a couple years, hand it off to Gus. Okay.
Sure.
So our first year, Gus comes in as the D coordinator. He's the energy guy. All I got to do is be the offensive guy. Now all I have to do is just, focus on offense and things like that. Gus brings the energy. He's doing all the pregame talks because, after 28 years, you run out of all the good ones.
Right.
You're just scratching every night like, oh, God, what can I say? So, it worked out perfect. And we just caught, again, kind of like Bigfoot. My first year at Bigfoot, that team was not good. And we made the playoffs for the first time. And it was just one of those things where you kind of catch lightning in a bottle and the bounces go your way. Well, here we had a group of seniors that were pretty successful in youth football and things like that, and just were kind of stuck in a system. They were running a spread, like a true spread, where I'm talking like, I don't even know if they were true RPOs, but it's all just bubble screens and
sure
reads and stuff like that. And these kids were downhill, blue collar, let's go kind of kids. And when we put that in, they loved it. And, we had just a crazy run there. We were actually in level 2. We were actually ahead of Wanakee 21-7. So we had them on the ropes too. And then, COVID hit. And so Gus was an hourly employee at Milton, so he had to go get a job. So he had to leave the actual school. We had spring. I had, for the first time in my entire life, I had a fall off, where I wasn't in the weight room or at football practice, or myself personally in high school attending football practice. And I was kind of like, boy, this fall season's pretty nice. Bought a little fix-it-all house. I'm like, wow, I kind of enjoy this. And I'm not kidding. That was the first time it ever crept in my head was when I was driving to spring practice, and I was like, I really kind of enjoyed that. And then Gus helped out in the spring, and then he went to UW Whitewater as a GA for a bit, and then so he wasn't on the staff. So honestly, it was the first time since 2007 where I wasn't coaching one of my kids or I had one of my kids on staff.
Yeah.
And again, I was just getting old, and then I'll never forget. It wasn't too much longer after that. It was I'm driving from Parkview, so I'm teaching in Parkview. I'm driving to Milton, and it's September or whatever, and I knew we weren't good. We weren't awful, but we weren't good. And again, once you've been here, it's tough to even motivate yourself to say, okay, let's sneak into the playoffs as an 8 seed and go get crushed by Kettle Moraine. So it was for the first time ever. I felt like I was driving to work. You know what I mean? I didn't I didn't have that, and I knew then. So it really wasn't that difficult of a decision. I just knew that, all of a sudden I didn't feel like watching 10 hours of film on the weekend. I had grandkids now coming up. And I just felt like, you know what, I don't know that I can do this as good as I want to do it. And if I can't do it as good as I want to do it, or if I don't feel like doing it as good as I want to do it, it's just time to step back. So it really wasn't that hard of a decision, and I'm fine with it. There's not a minute I've regretted it.
A while back, you made a top 25 list of best athletes you had coached. I'm sure some great athletes didn't make the cut there that went on to continue their sports careers. Was that the most rewarding part for you? Was to see kids kind of grow and use these tools you had given them throughout their high school career in sports?
Oh, absolutely. There is nothing better. And thank God for Facebook, even though it's mostly for older people like me. But like former players, students. I used to. I went like with Michael Walker. I went on a college visit with him and his parents. I went with Travis Frederick when I'll never forget. He walked into Barry Alvarez's office, and I'm with him. Trust me, when we went to the engineering building and they were talking about engineering and aerospace stuff, I'm not
Eyes
running
glazed
back.
over. Yeah.
I'll see you guys. I'll see you guys when you head back over to the football office. But it was funny because you're walking to Barry Alvarez's office. He's the guy who turned Wisconsin football around in my generation. So I'm all in. I'm ready to.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
what the hell are you waiting for? But no, it's great. It's great to even talk to those guys today. The kids I've coached. It's funny because I've coached lawyers. I've coached kids that are in jail today. It's one of those things where you stay in touch. And matter of fact, my starting wide receiver, my first year at Almond, has a grandkid.
Yeah, that'll get you.
Yeah.
Like I said in the opening here, you just recently got put in the Wisconsin Football Coaches Association Hall of Fame. So on top of your numerous awards and your team accomplishments, did this one mean the most to you, or do you have one that means the most to you looking back?
It does. It means a lot. Again, this was never something I thought of when I first started coaching. I never thought, oh boy, I really want to be in the Hall of Fame. I just, I did it for the love of the game, kids, things like that. It meant a lot to me for the timing, really, because it was like, his mom was getting older, and normally they wait until you retire. So the timing that I was recognized at that point meant a lot to me, and it meant a lot that the whole family was there, and that was really cool. It's something obviously you can't take away, and so that. But winning a state title, it's so funny because at the time, I'll never forget in 2008 when Travis Frederick was a senior, and we lost to Watoma and Jared Aberderis, which was crazy, by the way. I saw you had Brady Ewing on. When Travis was a sophomore in Division Four, you had Lou Zigwu from Platteville, went on to the NFL, Brady Ewing from Richland Center, right? Richland Center, I always get, yeah, who went on to the NFL. And then you had Jared Aberderis, went on to the NFL. All guys that are from small school, D4 schools. And we lost them. I'll never forget, Adam, I couldn't sleep for a week because I'm like, that's your one chance. As a head coach, oh my God, that was my one chance. I had this team. We made it this far. This was our one chance. And, I said, my next year's group, they're pretty talented, but they're a bunch of just kind of screwballs. I'm like, I don't know, And so that was tough. And then to win it was, that was special.
Yeah. So since we talked a little bit about Travis Frederick, let's talk a little bit about the Badgers. Sorry, my mic just acted up here. So you, like I said, you coached Travis Frederick. He retired as a Dallas Cowboy. He was on some of those Bielema coach teams when he was there. Did he give you any good stories? Are you still in touch with Travis? I assume so.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
he didn't give me a lot of stories. Like I said, Bielema used to invite us high school coaches up there to the camps. So this is before NIL, before they could even have the players conduct camps. So the high school coaches, and this was hilarious. They just bring us high school coaches in, and so I was an O line coach there, and so Bob Bostad, who was the O line coach at the time, he would literally line the high school kids up by height. So I had every 5'7" offensive lineman in Wisconsin who I was coaching. Everybody 6'4" and over, he was coaching. But
Yeah.
when they recruited Travis, and so the one thing with Bielema, a lot of people in Wisconsin weren't that high on him. But one thing I loved about it was one, he treated us all as high school coaches, just like we were part of it. He knew all our names. I could show up at a spring practice watching Travis Rodney. He would come over to the sideline. Hey, Rodney, how you doing? He was great that way. After we were done with camps, we'd get down at like 9:00, and you'd go down to the Big Ten pub, and he'd have free beer and free appetizers. We'd eat and drink as much as we want. He'd pop in and talk to us too. So I like that, and yeah, he went through that. But that time, like when Travis was a sophomore, I believe, all 5 offensive linemen went on to the NFL. And so, you kind of see that difference now. And I don't know if it's NIL, I don't know if it's transfer portal, but I used to be able to sit there and tell you, look at the Badgers defense, and 9 of the 11 kids played high school football in Wisconsin. And now I couldn't tell you probably 2 of the starters, where they played.
Yeah. And I mean, I had that conversation with Justin Ostrowski, kind of like, well, do you think that kind of way of how the Badgers used to do it, where they would kind of have walk-on guys from in-state and just, have them progress, like, did the transfer portal and NIL kill that? And, he kind of gave some insight, maybe these kids got to go to like JUCO first and then transfer in, but I just don't know that it'll ever be the same as it was, it's tough because those Wisconsin kids, especially like you listed, Brady was a walk-on. I mean, and like the interview I did with him was awesome because he talks about like, when he got there for some of the scholarship guys that got a scholarship right out the gate, that was a destination for them. For him, it was like, he was like, I'm not stopping here, So, in hindsight, since we're talking about Bielema, do you think the Badgers wish they would have worked harder to kind of meet some of his demands after seeing how well he's built up Illinois?
Well, here's the thing, and again, I'm looking at it from the coach's perspective. When Russell Wilson was a senior, that was the year. That was the one year. Because, you have to be realistic at those times where you had the BCS or you only had the top 4 teams. The Badgers were probably never going to get there. But the Russell Wilson, his senior year when he transferred from NC State, they had all those guys, and they lost on the last second play to Michigan State and to Ohio State. And I think he thought, again, because he's an Alvarez's shadow, I think maybe he thought that was his one chance, maybe to win a national title.
Yeah.
From there on, again, we're the Badger football, and I had no problem with Badger football being there where it was. Maybe make a New Year's Bowl game, play in the Outback Bowl against Auburn, but winning 10 games, But I think he wanted his next challenge, and obviously Arkansas. He found out when you're the head coach at Arkansas, recruiting against Alabama, Auburn, Tennessee.
Yeah,
that's not a whole lot of fun.
Right.
From a state like Arkansas, you talk about Wisconsin high school football. Trust me, Arkansas high school football might be a little different, a little more speed, but you got more to choose from in Wisconsin. So, but I think Illinois, again, it's his home state. I think he's done a good job there. He's always, like I said, he's a great people person. I've always liked him as a coach, and so I always kind of cheer for him. They're kind of my backup team.
Yeah, a couple of guys I've had on um, all had great things to say about him. So, um, since we talked a little bit about the past, let's talk a little bit about present Badgers. You have thoughts on Luke Fickell so far? And since you're a teacher, uh, can you give me a grade on his coaching so far, and maybe one thing he's done right and one thing he's missed the mark on? I think I know what you're going to say, missed the mark on, but I'll let you.
Well, here's the thing with Fickell. One, I think he's a good coach. I really do. I mean, I think he's a good. Remember when I was talking about different kind of coaches? I think he's an X and O's guy. I think he's good. It's tough because Wisconsin is a unique. Anywhere in the Midwest, it's kind of unique. I mean, you come into the Midwest, and like I talked about, running his style of offense in Wisconsin is tough. It's tough. It reminds me of Nebraska. Wisconsin has kind of become Nebraska. That's not a compliment.
Right.
Nebraska used to win a certain way. They recruited a certain kind of people that was unique to Nebraska. And Wisconsin did the same thing. And, my biggest problem, I guess, is, I looked at the top 15 ranked high school kids in Wisconsin. 5 of them went to Notre Dame. 4 of them went to Wisconsin. And that's, I just have a problem with that where you can't keep the in-state kids in-state. And like I said, I get it. His plan and what he wants to run doesn't necessarily fit Wisconsin kids. You know what I'm saying? And I get that. Where Barry Alvarez, Bielema, those guys wanted the road grader offensive linemen. The kids you can find in Brookfield East and all around Wisconsin that are 6'6" and 310 pounds, and they don't have to move left or right. They just, go downhill. But he wants a quick passing game where your offensive linemen aren't that involved. And a lot of times it's hard to recruit a good offensive lineman because I'll still never forget Travis Frederick when he was at Dallas, and I talked to him, and he would get so mad when Tony Romo would check out of a run on 3rd and 2 to pass the ball because he's like, all of us offensive linemen just want to go run block. We don't want to sit there and just make contact and let him throw a swing pass,
Right.
So I, that's my only concern is that Wisconsin is going to become that 6-6, 5-7, 7-5. Holy cow, we won 8 games type of program. When a lot of people don't realize that when Wisconsin did not qualify for a bowl this year, what was it? Only 3 teams in a bowl streak longer.
Yeah.
Wisconsin. Yeah. Yep. I mean, Wisconsin football has been as consistent and good as any.
Yeah, I think it was the first time they missed in like 22 or 23 years or something like that.
I know it was in the 20s, yeah.
So, but all right. Well, I always end these things. I ask 2 last questions, but we're going to switch it around since we already talked Badgers football, so we're going to keep it in that lane real quick. You touched a little bit on it, but how do you think they're going to do this year with? I mean, that schedule looks tough.
6-6. Just pencil it down for every year.
That's better than a lot of people have been saying, honestly.
I know. And I hate to say this, Adam, but I don't know if I can name a starter. It's weird. It's almost fallen off. Like, it no longer interests me that much, which is probably worse than being bad. Considering I was a Badger fan when Don Morton was running the veer option in the 80s, and they were awful.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to keep track of where everybody's transferred to. That's the toughest part. You're coming in with a whole new offense every single year. So,
right.
And then last one, if you have passed along one piece of advice to your kids that you hope that they pass along to theirs, what would you want that to be?
So pass along one piece of advice.
So what's one piece of advice that you've passed to your kids already that you hope that they pass on to theirs?
Well, again, there's 2 things. One of them I mentioned, but I've always told my kids, just be a good person. Because I'll tell you what, in today's world, if you work hard and you're a good person, I don't care what job you're in, you'll find a way. And the one thing, and I learned this from Brad Money, he was the president of ABC Supply, and he helped us out a lot in Beloit Memorial. And he would always tell those kids, I want you to think about every day as a job interview, because this teacher, this person you're talking to, this boss you have, one day you might run into somebody that knows them, that knows this person, that might give you a job or give you that break. And so be a good person, and every day's a job interview.
Yeah, I'm definitely learning that when trying to get guys on here.
Yep, exactly.
So it's not about what you know, it's about who you know.
Absolutely. Always. That's the other one that my dad taught me, and it's still true today.
All right, Coach Wedig. We had Coach Wedig here dropping the wisdom and knowledge of over 30 years of coaching with us today. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the Dadger. And as always, on Wisconsin.